And we are back together. Okay. So we've talked about the American Little Theater movement and how important it was in American theater in finding and developing new American playwriting voices, in spreading theater into smaller towns in the United States, and becoming a route for community theaters. It was a place that you can tell from the things you read that gave room for women to be both directors but also writers and to tell stories that are woman focused. So now I want you to learn a little bit about another movement that is nestled kind of within the American Little Theater movement. It's also part of the Harlem Renaissance, and that is the Black Little Theater movement. The Black Little Theater movement was a push for theater that was by and for Black Americans. It tells stories that highlight the Black experience. It gives the stage to Black voices, Black artists, and it presents images that had not yet been seen on the American stage of Black people in America. Their stories, their voices, their concerns. It's political in its own way, much of this theater, telling truths about what it's like to be Black in America that were not otherwise being seen on the stage. So the Black Little Theater movement has fewer kind of big name artists coming out of it. There's not a Eugene O'Neill equivalent, but that does not equate to its importance in the development of American theater, because without the Black Little Theater movement, we arguably don't get A Raisin in the Sun just a couple of decades later. And we certainly don't end up with August Wilson, for example. So it's a very important part of American theater history. And you're going to get to read a play that comes out of this particular movement. We can define the Black Little Theater movement as a distinct movement that flourishes between 1918 and 1929, distinct from the rest of the American Little Theater movement, okay? There is a general interest in Black theater during this time period. It's not mainstream and dominant, but there is an interest. And it's interestingly not just with Black artists. There are white artists who become interested in how the stage might tell stories of the Black experience. That interest is fueled by tours. This might seem weird to you, but it's fueled by tours to the United States of the Irish Players. The Irish Players are a independent theater out of Ireland that was telling stories in sort of vernacular Irish voices of the rural experience. And this was seen as quite fresh and new to audiences both in the UK and in the US. And when the Irish Players toured to the US, American theater artists, Black and white, started to say, why don't we have sort of a vernacular folk sort of theater form that is happening right now in the US? It felt modern, even though it's like rural. It felt modern. It felt modern, I think, because it wasn't flashy and because it was so connected to realism. So we get this movement, this little mini movement for folk plays in the United States because of the Irish Players. A lot of those folk plays are rural white people. They're like Appalachia plays. We get a lot of Appalachia plays. But there's also part of this interest in folk theater that is about the Black experience being on stage, not as what was usually the depiction of Black people on stage, which was song and dance kind of things, and then minstrel show comedy, but as people with serious but humble lives and serious but humble problems to be depicted. And the first people to get traction telling those stories, unsurprisingly, were white theater artists because they already had a platform of power from which to tell stories. So they wanted to see stories of the folk experience, the Black folk experience in America, so they wrote them themselves. Very problematic, right? But you can see where it comes from this moment in history. So the great example of that would be Ridgely Torrance's 3 Plays for a Negro Theater, 1917. It's 3 short plays. You can look it up on they're called Granny Malamy, The Writer of Dreams, and Simeon the Cyrenian. You can look that up on in your book. I think there's a discussion of it. It's also easy to find on the internet. But it was on Broadway in 1917, this 3 Plays for a Negro Theater. Ridgely Torrance is a white author. The director is a white director, Robert Edmond Jones, who was a member of the Provincetown Players, right? And is a designer. He's also a director. He did the design, costume, and scenic, and the direction for 3 plays for Negro theater. He was very interested in this work happening. You'll also find it interesting that when the first of those plays, Granny Malmy, was performed, before it got to Broadway, it was performed sort of as a little one-off, and it had a white cast in blackface. Even though the point of Ridgely Torrance's play was to somehow authentically tell the Black experience, it was 1916 at the time when that little blip happened, and it had white actors in blackface makeup. But Ridgely Torrance did not like that, to his credit. He said that's not what this is supposed to be, and so he insisted that when it was performed on Broadway, it have a black cast. And Robert Edmond Jones had the same vision for the play. So it was performed on Broadway in 1917 with an all-black cast, which is significant in 1917, and it was serious drama. It wasn't a song and dance show. But it's not quite where we need to be in terms of who is telling the story, right? That's going to be the business of the Black Little Theater movement, to have the storytellers or the storytelling be in the hands of Black Americans also. So there are these theaters that are born, inspired by what has been seen as, a model in the American Little Theater movement, that are specifically Black little theaters. So the Krigwa Little Theater in Washington, D.C. is a famous example, the Harlem Experimental Theater, the Folk Theater of Chicago. There are several others in D.C., in New York, in Chicago, and in other towns. There's many of these. These are 3 that you're likely to hear of, though, and I'll mention a couple others in this lecture and in the next one. The Black little theaters were very interested, as I have said, in cultivating playwrights. That's where they have a lot in common with the general American Little Theater movement. They wanted to cultivate, promote, and highlight Black playwrights. And because of this, they had a nice relationship with magazines, with periodicals. There were a couple of periodicals. There's 3 big ones: Crisis, Opportunity, and one called Fire, which I didn't put on this slide, which all were Black-run news magazines, periodicals in the period. They're connected to the Harlem Renaissance, and they are serious journals. They're academic, they're literary, and they are helping to encourage and to promote a empowered and educated Black American citizenry, and to present an image of intelligence and artistry from Black America to a reading public who might be interested in this vision. So it was a really important arm of the pro-Black, often called New Negro in the period movement, that is connected to the Harlem Renaissance. Well, these journals had playwriting contests, and many of the plays that come out of the Black Little Theater movement arrived sort of on the scene because of the playwriting contest that the magazines would promote. Isn't that interesting? So some important plays to come out of this include Plumes, which you're reading, by Georgia Douglas Johnson, Colorstruck by Zora Neale Hurston, and Rachel by Angelina Weld Grimke. I love that all 3 of these women have 3-part names. Somehow that resonates with me. So you're reading Plumes, and you'll see what that's about. Colorstruck is about colorism in the Black community, and Rachel is an anti-lynching play. So I'm going to pause here for a moment, and we're going to pick back up for just a couple of extra slides about anti-lynching plays. You're not reading Rachel, but I want to tell you a little bit about it. And then you also can pick this up with the little mini lecture that's about Plumes to prep you for reading that play. So I'll see you at both of those.